So let's talk a little bit about setting. First in general, and then sort of in specific, to both Cinderella and to what I'm doing. I talked last time about things like artifice. There are a few $10 words in a discussion about setting, artifice, verisimilitude, atmosphere. All these words mean specific things and also really nothing at all. All words are made up, as Thoreau Smith said. Uh, Really, there's kind of two schools of thought about setting. And you can take this for what you will, and this is sort of dependent on what you actually like. There are people that really think setting is very important to the story you're telling. There are people that are hyper specific, people that get into a lot of detail, um, and that's not bad. A lot of Italian westerns, especially like the old Clint Eastwood movies, are based on principles of the setting is its own character, and it's done through an Italian lens. Most of those Clint Eastwood cowboy movies were directed by Italians, scored by Italians. And it's interesting because Europe has this whole thing specifically about the myth of the American Wild West. They recognize it more as a myth, I believe. I don't think they take it as seriously as we do as like a real place. They certainly made it into the myth that we kind of know and love it as in a lot of ways. Um, so that's kind of the first sort of person. This is kind of an immersive person. This person will probably look for details. They might be a person really into making something historically accurate. Um, I've done this when I do stuff with like Edgar Allan Poe that is hyper specific or has a very, very important feel. The Five Nights at Freddy video games and movie kind of do this. It takes that idea of nostalgia. This kind of nitty gritty, very into the feeling person um, probably has a love hate relationship specifically with the Hilary Duff Cinderella. Because this is the sort of thing where they're upset that it's not in this kind of forested thing. They're upset that it's not in medieval times. They don't really they don't seem to understand that the idea is that it's a hierarchy. Like if there's a reason Cinderella cannot live her house, either because it's taboo, because it's a magical spell, because she just doesn't really want to leave for whatever reason, honoring your father's memory. The whole point is that it's a hierarchy that oppresses her in varying ways. So the high school analogy works really well. Setting it in Beverly Hills or Hollywood or wherever it was set works really well because it's an examination of kind of hierarchy and empowerment as much as it's about the magic of falling in love. Um, some adaptations of Cinderella work really well because they do a kind of K-drama style where they update the mythology, but it's still very almost medieval and hierarchical. The movie, what's the name of the movie? I'm gonna please hold as I Google this. All right, so another good example of kind of an updated, but still keeping the hierarchy principles, still having a fantasy element, still being like low class versus higher class, Crazy Rich Asians 2018. It's essentially a Cinderella story. It's updated, she's self-actualized, but there's a lot of Cinderella elements to it. So that's the first type of thing. The first type of thing is where it's a big deep dive and it has to be a certain way. Something where the atmosphere becomes really relevant. So I would argue the live action Cinderella with Lily James and Richard Madden is like that because it's a hyper specific kind of sweet fever dream, sort of modern, but definitely set in olden times. There was one review of that particular Cinderella that called it confectionery, but in a not good way. I would agree some of the set dressing did get in the way of the story, but there are some magnificent set dressing shots from that I think are important. So that's the first one. The second one is where the setting isn't really that important to them. It's all about the message of the story. And they believe a thing can take place in her. These are the people that when you go to a party and they they say they're a writer. They're one of the people that bring up the fact that there are only like 6 stories that are ever told, and it's just remixing them. They are not bad people. I do think they're a little nearsighted about their own art practice, of course, because this is something I think about and I struggle with, of why put a setting somewhere. What would be the best place to do something like this? Like having a vacation in Vermont is different than having a vacation in Hawaii. And it's silly not to acknowledge those differences to me. This is a person that believes a holiday movie could take place anywhere, and it's just you need these 5 elements. Sometimes it includes setting as a person, sometimes it doesn't. People like this are the reason we got a really bad Blair Witch sequel where they actually show the witch. Um, and it's really, those are the two schools of thought about setting. Most people are sort of a hybrid. Most people recognize what a setting is, when it needs to be used. That's why Steven Spielberg can both direct Jurassic Park and I'm really doing all the references today. That's why he can do things like Jurassic Park and then go on to the set of Casper, because he recognizes setting is important, but he's not so beholden to it that he can't juggle 2 things in his mind at the same time, for instance. Um, and here's where we start getting into words, because here's the decision that you need to make as an author, as a writer, as a creator of a world, is how important is it to you to have a location be something hyper specific? How important is it to you to have a location rooted in realism? A great example of a thing where location doesn't really matter is Dr. Seuss. In some ways, it does. You do need a location with a house if you're doing a Cat in the Hat. You have to have an actual neighborhood where people have homes. If you're doing The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, you have to have a concept of a holiday like Christmas, if not Christmas itself. So there's some where it is hyper specific, but then you get Sneetches where the beach could be anywhere. Sneetches with stars on Mars. You get Hop on Pop, which takes place anywhere where you have a hop that can be hopped on, as it were. Um, when you think about Dr. Seuss, the idea is that it's abstract in order to get out of the way almost of telling it. Oh, the places you'll go is like this really cute, sweet thing that gets given to like high schoolers when they're graduating high school. That's how I've started to hear it. But the abstractness of the places were really so they got out of the way of the message Dr. Seuss is trying to tell. The Great Butter War is about, I think it's about nuclear war, actually. And that is not about a specific location. Most of his locations are fantastical, specifically, so they're not specific. And you find this a lot in theater as well. So in theater, you might hear the word artifice, which is really just how artificial looks, how much you're aware you're sitting in a theater seeing a thing. You might also hear the word verisimilitude, which is a very fun word, a very pretty word. And verisimilitude is about having a thing that is really cleaner than it would be in real life. So if you go to see like an opera where the operatic star comes singing through a marketplace, they're not going to show all the dirt and all the trash in the marketplace. It's going to look insanely clean. It's going to be presentable for the actors to show off the costumes and the lighting if there is it. And it's not going to be real to life, but it being not real to life doesn't distract. In fact, it enhances the story because then you're not distracted by the reality of the thing. Les Mis sort of does verisimilitude in the opposite. Les Mis is all about a France that's really gone into like a purgatory Dantean direction, as it were. There's something very gritty and dark and deep about the France where the end of the story essentially takes place in the sewers with the survivors, sort of thing. Les Mis is not a happy show. It's hard to imagine why you'd want to go see it during the winter holidays because nothing's going to bum you out more than a failed revolution, right? And you can also think of it in setting can be used to give you a moment in time. I've discovered a TV show that was a spinoff of a very beloved TV show that goes even deeper into the time period. So the show originally was Bewitched. and Bewitched is about Darren and Samantha, and then later their daughter Tabitha. And this kind of takes place in sort of this late 50s, early 60s, very modern for the time vibe. It's really about, the mom hiding her witchiness and all the problems that husband, who is immortal, has with the extended family, who doesn't respect him, at least her mom and Dora. Um, and there was a spinoff they did for the daughter, Tabitha. Uh, there's interesting thing about it in which Tabitha is more of its time, specifically in trying to modernize it for that time period. It sticks it so directly in that time period. Tabitha lives in an apartment building. She has a VW Bug. The actress sang the theme song. So it's very of that moment. It feels very much like the time period it's in. And that's something to consider in your setting. So kind of coming back for full circle, the reason that the Hilary Duff Cinderella story works is because it takes the idea of Cinderella and keeps a hierarchy and sets it in high school. Things in high school are popular because people know what to expect from a high school most of the time, 90% of the time, even in Glee. Glee was popular specifically because the high school setting kind of gave it some legitimacy. When they left high school and they were still doing the same thing, is when it really started to fall apart. That hierarchy, that expectation tells you what to expect. I am not taking that for granted in this. It's kind of actually important to me to keep some of the elements of this hierarchical system in place. It explains a bit of why Seven, my Cinderella character, won't leave home, but he's also at a place in his life where he's kind of got a Luke Skywalker moment where he's actively talking about wanting to leave home, looking for something new, wanting to make a change, wanting to grow up. Um, and that's an interesting thing to think about, is that hierarchy always affects your characters. This setting purposely has a hierarchy in it in order for it to affect characters. There's something to be said in the Cinderella story about who has power, who doesn't, and what do they do with it. I don't think it's a mistake that the king is sort of a bumbling fool and that Cinderella's prince didn't really have lines in the 1950s Cinderella. I don't think that was any mistake. I'm really drawn to the 97 Cinderella. I really love the relationship between Victor Garber and Whoopi Goldberg and Paulo Montalban as their kid. Um, I think there's something really magical about what that version of Cinderella did. That it wasn't just a telecast, it was above it, but its setting is very much of the time. For 97, it was a very good reproduction of the setting, but it's also fantastical. So it's medieval, it has hierarchy, it has structure. You expect something of it when you see something like that. You expect the king to be a certain way. Whether it meets or doesn't meet expectations is kind of up to the creative staff, of course. But the setting does a lot to kind of code and enforce expectations. And it's really an important decision that you make. Uh, there is a really great PDF that is free that you can find online, and I will either put a Google link or actually put the MIT link in to the notes here. And it's by Eleanor Fuchs. I'm pretty sure I'm saying her last name wrong. But Eleanor did something called EF's Visit to a Small Planet, some questions to ask a play. And this is really useful. This is something I always give creative writing students when I'm teaching a class. And this is an essay about how you build a world and what you shouldn't take for granted in your setting, which is anything. It includes things like, what if your Earth is not made of Earth? What do the people breathe in your world? Where do they live? What do they wear? How do they even shop for the things they get? And it's one of those things where you kind of don't think about that in a play most of the time. Most of the time, that's going to be shorthanded. Most of the time, it's taken for granted. But you could have a play where it's very important. You could have a play like Death of a Salesman, where it is a bit about scarcity. You could have a play like Cat in the Hot Tin Roof, where alcohol plays a major role in it, where hierarchy plays a major role in it, where death and grief and how they even build buildings plays a major role in the play. Those are all kind of wrapped up in setting. Those are all kind of wrapped up in the atmosphere and the presentation. This is something that even the silliest horror movies do well. Because if you have a horror movie in a cornfield, you expect there to be a cornfield for your horror movie. Now, what you do with that cornfield, it's kind of up to you. Whether it's dried, whether it's lush, whether it's tall, whether it's short, whether it's a labyrinth or a maze, those are all decisions you make. But if you're deciding, I'm going to make a horror movie set in a cornfield, the expectation is that there will be a cornfield of some kind. Now, that cornfield could be a cornfield that the audience learns later the corn is made out of glass, but it's made to look real. It could be a cornfield made out of people. It could be a cornfield with the demon underneath it that the children worship. Who's to say? If you like hybrided Children of the Corn with The Shining, you could do like corn topiaries. It'd be really fun. You could also decide, for instance, in this cornfield, about the idea of what happens in a cornfield during the day versus night. And Night Shyamalan Signs is very good at things like that. And that's something to consider as well. Consider in the case of a Cinderella fairy tale, the ball always seems to happen at night. Cinderella's kind of oppression is always like daytime regular chores, except for like nighttime when she's sometimes left alone. Generally speaking, Cinderella is mostly a day-themed story. Things happen in the sunlight for the most part, except for the ball, which happens at night. Now, is that important to you? And you might be asking, is that important to me? And the answer is, well, yes and no. I think there is something to be said for deciding what it means to have shadows in your play. I think there's something to be said for anticipating your lighting, but that is also something that you don't want to interfere with the lighting director's vision too much. You want to give them enough that they can do your vision, but also lighting directors are artists as well. So you want to give a lighting director the ability to have some input as well into what is appropriate. There's nothing that pisses off a lighting director more than you deciding exactly what your lights should look like in your show, which gives them absolutely no leeway. What's interesting is this is something too you have to think about strategically in setting, is that lighting on stage may not always give you the same mood you want, because there's a way you light it for night, but there are still lights. So people going to see a play, they're still going to know on some level it's light. It's not something you can ever escape. You could do it where you like rent a house and you have extras and people have to dress up to show up. That's a different theatrical experience. I do not begrudge it. Very different from a more traditional theatrical production. But it's something to think about, is in setting for a play specifically, you are evoking something. It may not be true to itself. This is one problem people had with the Harry Potter films. As they got older and older in the Harry Potter films, everything became darker and darker until you couldn't see anything. And I'm not sure exactly what the thought process was, but by film 5, I couldn't see anything at all. Everything for the first 10 minutes before they got into the fantasy world was this giant blur of like blackness in the London night. You can't do that. You may want that mood, but you have to light things in a certain practical and realistic way. And that's something that I have not gotten a chance to do with any of my works yet. Most of my work has been guerrilla, so I'm kind of excited to go through that process with the lighting director and see if something come to fruition in that way. But that's something else about the theater, is that you can do guerrilla, and if you explain to people it's night, or you show a bedroom set with someone sleeping, there'll be an expectation, because when people see a bedroom, they assume sleep, they assume safety sometimes. If they see like a toy box with toys, they assume kids' bedroom. If they see a sling, they assume adult bedroom. And that's something that is really interesting about setting to think about, is how realistic do you want to be, and what is it going to influence in your work to have it be in a setting? What happens if Five Nights at Freddy's happens outdoors? Well, we got a little bit of that in the film, but not completely. Like the robots were still confined to, the defunct pizza place. That defunct pizza place is, in some ways, very important. In some ways, when you go outside of it, you lose the rails of the universe a little bit, right? Um, but setting is really important. And to me, in this, in Cobblestone Kingdom, what I want for the setting more than anything is for people to know that they're seeing a Cinderella story. I specifically have parts of the set that are omnipresent the whole time. I like the foresty vibe of Cinderella. I want to keep that vintage foresty kingdom vibe. I have fey sprite like creatures that are in the play that act sort of as narrators and keep the story moving. I feel like they need sort of that natural environment. There are references to giants, which are normally found in like a British forest scenario. You're not really going to find a giant in a canyon. Maybe you will. If you're doing a Wild West version of Cinderella and you decided you need giants, you might do it a Grand Canyon style and you would focus more on rocks and deserty and, lots of holes kind of thing. And that's not bad, but that's not what Cobblestone Kingdom is. Even the word cobblestone and Cobblestone Kingdom really, I want to give you an idea of where you're going to be. For me, setting is important in a lot of ways, even if it's just the shorthand of what people expect. Um, but I'm much closer to that camp of setting is a character. Probably because I like see it all the time in horror movies, and I expect some things from like found footage films, especially. Um, but setting is really something that is an important part of the technique. It's an important thing to think about. And one of the things I like about ES Visit to a Small Planet is it doesn't take anything for granted. It makes you think about all of those things. If you have something that is happening underground, you have something that is happening underwater, you have something happening with a volcano nearby, those are all things that influence the world. It's something I both love and kind of hate about Doctor Who, is that Doctor Who sort of just hangs around this one um, kind of either British place in the modern times, or they go into space, or they go to another planet. And that's not bad, but the doctors are always kind of dressed the same unless other characters are not, and it would make him stick out almost too much. There's never been a moment on Doctor Who where I felt like they really grabbed for that fantastical element as much. There are some times when they grabbed for the horror element a lot. The episode where they literally meet Satan, and the doctor is dressed in like one of those hazmat suits. That is a moment. But generally speaking, the doctor shows up and he's still himself and he still sticks out. Um, the newer Doctor had more of a problem than the older Doctor did. I think Tennant specifically, and maybe Matt Smith had that problem. It's not bad. It's a way of doing things. It's not something that distracts me all the time, but there are some times when it was distracting enough where I'm like, now I know I'm watching a TV program. I'm not really getting sucked into it as much as I want to be. Um, when they brought on Catherine Tate, I feel like they tried to kind of rectify that a little bit. But there was so much good about that season that I kind of forgive it for some of its messes that tried to tangle up Tennant in. Um, Anywho, setting is important. Thinking about setting is important. In the case of my version of Cinderella, right, my Cobblestone Kingdom, um, I didn't use if visit to a small planet because I already knew arbitrarily I was setting it, in not a specific, but kind of this grandiose, mythic, medieval time period, sort of. Um, it does have a king and queen, but I don't really set what exactly they have to look like. I do have one specific piece of prop that has to be made, which is a masquerade mask. So that may set it specifically to a time period. But this is something, the lighting director, the costume designer, and a whole bunch of people will collaborate with me on. And I'm excited for that collaboration and where it will go. Beyond that, I'm providing the script. That's kind of my job. is to provide the structure that the rest of the body will go on to. For me, that's what a script is. And the setting in some way is the musculature of that skeleton. Not very good anatomy, so I'm not going to use that much. But yeah. So today we're thinking about talking about setting. If you want to see a really great way where setting is both used to showcase where you are and showcase the fantastic, the animated version of the Rugrats from the 90s is a really great version of that. It's a thing where it's pastiche, where they interpret it through baby's eyes, so you can be forgiven for discrepancies from what we think of as normal. It's also a great way that was used to pay homage to stuff. Their version of like their homage to Wild West, to the Showdown, to High Noon. They use bubblegum instead of guns, but they still keep sort of that sandbox Wild West element. And that's a fantastic episode. I might link that as well if I can find a good kind of link of it online. Yeah. But so if you're looking to think about setting and it's not something you've done before, now that you kind of hopefully know what medium you're doing your project in, if you are doing a project and following along with my thesis work, now it's time to start thinking about setting. And I'll give a link, or you can even just Google search E.F. Fuchsia's Visit to a Small Planet, and you'll find it. And yeah, just think about how important setting is to you in your projects. That philosophy of setting being hyper specific and super important is very different than, there are 6 stories that can be set anywhere and they can be interchanged because that's all we have. It's a very different thing. And it does work for some people to do it either way. And it worked for some people to contain multitudes and hybrid the two. You just have to find what works for you. Part of what my thesis work is for and is about discovering is this idea of what is my voice. This is sort of the pinnacle of what is my voice that I've been working on, specifically this play since 2014. Cobblestone Kingdom has been in development in some form or another since about 2014, up to today. And it's really the question of why do I make what I make and what does it mean? And a part of that is the setting and the audience expectation and how I meet that, how I change that, and what's important to me. So yeah, what setting is important to you? What settings have you kind of seen that you still think about? What settings did you see that distracted you and took you out of whatever you're watching? Like, was there that version of that most recent version of Peter Pan that was like a YA novel? Did that really take you out of it, or did you like that it was more, hook-like and or less hook-like? Anywho, I'll see you next week for whatever I talk about next week. Now that we've talked about setting, we're really kind of getting on the ground, and by the time you listen to this, I'll be looking ahead toward classes in the coming week, and I'll have a much better grasp on my thesis, and we'll get real down to the nitty-gritty. We'll start digging down, and I can't wait for you to join. I'll see you next time.